I want to tell you something about the specific feeling of realizing that someone has been lying to you. Not out of embarrassment or self-protection, but with deliberate, calculated intent. It is different from ordinary deception. It has a quality to it that sits in your chest differently. A particular cold that comes from understanding that someone looked at you and made a decision about you before you even knew they existed. I moved to a new neighborhood in early spring 2 years ago. Small, quiet street on the edge of a mid-sized city. The kind of neighborhood where the houses are spaced far enough apart that you can go days without seeing anyone, and where the silence in the evenings has a quality that is either peaceful or unsettling depending on your mood. I had chosen it deliberately. I was coming out of a period of my life that had been loud and complicated, and I wanted somewhere that was neither of those things. 3 days after I moved in, there was a knock at the door. I was still surrounded by half-unpacked boxes. The man at the door was older, mid-50s maybe, tall with dark hair going gray at the temples, and a casual friendliness that read as genuine in the moment. He said his name was David and that he lived a few houses down. He had seen the moving truck and wanted to come introduce himself and welcome me to the street. I appreciated it. I invited him to stand in the doorway while we talked because the house was still a disaster of boxes and I was not yet in a position to invite anyone inside comfortably. He was easy to talk to. He asked the natural questions. Where had I moved from? Was I settling in all right? Did I know anyone in the area? I answered honestly because there was nothing in the conversation that suggested I should not. He mentioned a wife, Sandra. Said they had lived on the street for 12 years and loved it. Said the neighbors were good people and that I would find it welcoming once I had been there a little while. He left after about 15 minutes. And I went back to unpacking feeling better about the move than I had before he knocked. Over the following week, I saw him twice from a distance. Once walking his dog and once getting into his car. Both times he waved. Both times I waved back. Small, normal, neighborly interactions that did nothing except reinforce the impression he had made on my first day. On the 9th day, after moving in, he came back. He stood at the door and told me that he and Sandra were hosting a neighborhood dinner that evening. Said they did it a few times a year to keep everyone connected. Said it would be a good chance for me to meet the other people on the street and that it started at 7:30. He said Sandra was already cooking and that they would be happy to have me. I said yes without much hesitation. I had been alone in the house for over a week by that point, and the idea of meeting people in a relaxed setting was genuinely appealing. He smiled and said he looked forward to seeing me there and walked back down the driveway. At 7:20, I walked the 4 houses down to his place. The street was dark and quiet in the specific way it always was after sunset. No lights on in the neighboring houses. No cars in his driveway. No sounds from inside when I came up to the front door. The door was slightly open. I knocked anyway, and he called from somewhere inside, telling me to come in. I stepped into the hallway. The lights were on but low. The kind of low that is either atmospheric or a cost-saving measure, and in this context felt like something else entirely. I called hello. No response, except my own voice coming back to me off the walls. I walked toward where I had heard his voice come from. The kitchen. Empty. No food on the counter. No smell of cooking. No signs of anything that suggested a dinner had ever been planned for that evening. No plates. No glasses. No evidence of Sandra or anyone else. The front door slammed shut behind me. I did not call his name again. I walked back to the hallway immediately and tried the door. 3 locks engaged from inside. Dead bolt, chain, a turn lock on the handle itself, all of them set. None of them things you set by accident when a door blows shut. I started working through them as quickly as I could. Behind me, I heard a sound from one of the rooms. Not a loud sound. A quiet, deliberate creak of a floorboard being tested. I had all 3 locks open by the time I heard him walking toward me. His voice when he spoke was different from how it had been on both previous occasions. Lower, the friendliness entirely gone from it. He asked where I thought I was going. I got the door open, and I ran. Not back to my house. Past it, down the street and around the corner to where a gas station sat on the main road. I called the police from there. By the time officers arrived at my house, David was at my door, knocking, looking through the side window. When the patrol car turned onto the street, he moved away quickly, but they had already seen him. In the conversation that followed at the station, I learned that his name was not David. I learned that there was no wife named Sandra and had not been for some time, according to neighbors who had lived on the street far longer than either of us. I learned that no neighborhood dinner had ever been planned and that none of the other neighbors had been invited to anything. I learned that he had been watching the house before I moved in. Police found photographs on his phone, the house in various states of vacancy, the driveway, the front window, images taken from outside over a period of weeks before I arrived. He had chosen the house. He had waited. He had introduced himself 3 days after I moved in and asked me carefully and conversationally whether I had moved with anyone. Nothing could be charged that night. No crime had been committed that they could prove beyond reasonable doubt. They told me to document everything and to contact them immediately if he approached me again. I was out of that house within 3 weeks. I still think about the moment the door closed behind me in that hallway. The complete silence of a house where a dinner party was supposed to be happening. The specific cold understanding of what the silence meant. I think about it every time a stranger is friendly to me, in a way that feels just slightly too easy, just slightly too practiced. I do not think I will ever fully stop noticing that. I have lived in the same house for most of my adult life. My parents bought it when I was young, and when they moved to be closer to my sister, they signed it over to me, and I've been here since. The neighborhood is the kind that changes slowly. The same families for years, and then a new one every so often when someone passes away or finally moves somewhere smaller. I know most of the houses by the people in them, and most of the people well enough to wave and occasionally stop and talk. The house across the street from mine had been empty for about 4 months when someone moved into it. I did not go over to introduce myself. That is not something I have ever been comfortable doing, and at that point in my life, I was particularly uninterested in adding new social obligations. I watched him move boxes out of a truck from my front window, and he looked ordinary enough, younger than me by maybe 10 years. No particular reason for concern. A week passed without incident. Then I came home from work one evening, and he was standing on the pavement in front of my house, not walking past, not approaching the door, standing on the pavement facing the house with his hands in his jacket pockets looking at it. I pulled into the driveway and sat in the car for a moment, watching him through the windshield. He did not react to my arrival, did not acknowledge the headlights or the sound of the engine. Just stood there looking at the front of my house. I got out and walked toward him, and by the time I reached the end of the driveway, he was already walking away down the pavement, not quickly. The specific pace of someone pretending they were always walking and had not been standing still a moment ago. I called out to him. He did not turn around. I watched him until he turned the corner, and then I went inside. The next morning I saw him at his upstairs window. The blinds moved as I looked up. the specific motion of someone stepping back quickly from a position they had been holding. I stood on my front path for a moment, looking at the window, and then went back inside and told myself that people stand at windows, and the fact that he had looked at me once while I happened to be looking at him was not something that meant anything. That evening after dark, I looked out my front window, and he was at the end of the driveway again. Same posture, same stillness, facing the house. I went to the front door and opened it and walked toward him. I kept my voice calm and my manner as unthreatening as I could manage because I did not want to escalate something that might still have an innocent explanation. I asked if he needed something. He looked at me for a moment and then turned and started walking down the pavement again, as if the question had not been addressed to him. I could not sleep that night. I lay in bed with the specific awareness of a house that might not be as private as it had always seemed. That feeling of being observable when you have always assumed you were not. I woke in the early hours from a dream I could not remember and sat up in complete darkness and complete silence and felt immediately and certainly that I was not alone in the house. I did not open my bedroom door. I sat with my back against the headboard and listened. After a minute, I heard it. Slow, deliberate creaks in the hallway. Not the random settling sounds of an old house. A rhythm. A pace. Someone moving carefully toward my door and then stopping. I got down off the bed and onto the floor and crawled to the door. I put my eye to the gap at the bottom. His eye was looking back at me. He had lowered himself to the floor on the other side of the door and pressed his face to the gap and was looking directly back at me through it. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then I scrambled back and grabbed my phone. I called the police. I stayed on the floor with my back against the bed and the phone in both hands, and listened to him move around outside the door for another minute before the house went quiet again. By the time the officers arrived, he was gone. They found nothing. I told them about the neighbor, about the pavement, about the window, about the nights of watching. They went across the street and knocked, and he answered the door. Despite it being 2 a.m. and despite the fact that he was clearly awake, they brought him in. His search history going back more than a month had my name in it. My address, my workplace, searches conducted before he had ever moved into the street. Before he had any reason to know I existed. He had moved across the street for me on purpose. The case went through the system slowly, the way these things do. He was eventually charged. He had a history of similar behavior in a previous city that had never resulted in serious consequences. I still live in this house. I have better locks now. I have cameras. I know which floorboards creak, and I know the specific sounds my house makes at 2 a.m. when it is settling versus when it is not. I have not stopped listening for the difference. I moved for work. New city. New apartment. The kind of fresh start that sounds clean and uncomplicated when you are planning it, and is somewhat less clean and uncomplicated when you are actually doing it alone in a place where you do not know anyone and your only social interaction is the commute and the office and the commute back. The building was small. 6 units across 3 floors. My apartment was on the top floor. The only other unit on my floor belonged to a woman who had apparently been there for several years. She gave me the tour when I moved in. She was in her late 40s, quiet in a way that was not exactly unfriendly, but was not exactly friendly either. Flat affect. Long hair. The kind of face that gave very little away about what was happening behind it. I thought she was probably just a private person. I could respect that. I was planning to be private myself. She was waiting outside my door when I got home from my first day at work. I was tired and not expecting her, and I probably seemed more startled than I meant to. She looked at me with that flat expression and asked what time I usually got home. I said I was not sure because I had just started the job. She did not acknowledge the answer. She turned and went into her apartment and closed the door with the specific force of someone who is not slamming it but wants you to understand that the conversation is over. I went inside and told myself she was just an awkward person making an awkward attempt at neighborly interest. At 6 the next morning, she knocked on my door. Not gently. The kind of knock that is several degrees too forceful for 6 a.m. I opened it in the state that people are in at 6 a.m. when they have been woken suddenly. She was standing there in the same clothes she had been wearing the night before with the same expression. She asked if I would come over to her apartment after work that evening. I said I was busy. She turned and closed her door. It happened again, the following morning. Same time, same knock, same request, delivered in the same flat, emotionless voice. Same abrupt departure when I declined. On the third day, I worked late and did not get back until after 9. The corridor was dark. Her door was closed. I exhaled and put my key in my lock. The door was already unlocked. I stood with my hand on the handle and processed this. I had locked it that morning. I was certain I had locked it. I always locked it. There was only one other person in the building who had access to a master key. I should have left. I know that now. In the moment I convinced myself I was catastrophizing, that there was some mundane explanation, that I was letting 3 days of odd interactions make me see threat in something that was probably administrative. I pushed the door open and went inside. The lights were off. Everything in the apartment appeared exactly as I had left it. I let out a slow breath, told myself I had been wrong to worry, walked toward my bedroom. She was standing beside my bed. The room was dark, and she was standing in the dark beside my bed with her face mostly in shadow and a kitchen knife held at her side in her right hand. She did not move when I came to the doorway. She did not speak. She just stood there with that flat expression that I had never been able to read, and that I now understood I had been reading wrong entirely. I ran for the front door. It did not open. She had jammed the mechanism somehow. The handle moved, but the door did not. I heard her footsteps coming from the bedroom. I turned around and she came at me, and I did something I have no clear memory of deciding to do. I caught her wrist and took the knife from her and held her to the floor, and called the police with my free hand while she made no sound at all, and looked at the ceiling with that same expression she had worn every time I had seen her. The officers came. They took her out in handcuffs. I did not notice until the adrenaline started leaving me that she had gotten a shallow cut across the back of my left arm at some point. Not deep, but enough to remind me for the weeks it took to heal exactly how close the outcome had been. Her family said she had stopped taking medication several months earlier. They said she had episodes. They said it was not something she could control. I said thank you and moved out of that apartment within the week. I think about the 3 mornings. The knock, the flat voice asking me to come over, the complete absence of anything readable in her expression. I wonder sometimes how many times she had been inside my apartment before that night. I wonder what would have happened if I had come home at the usual time instead of late. If I had been there already when she arrived. I have thought about those questions many times over the past 2 years. And I have never found answers that make me feel better about them. I do not think I ever will.